Hey, deserving listeners, 90 Day Fiancé. Before the 90 days, let's watch. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. As I always say, don't use YouTube as a replacement for therapy. If you need a therapist, get one. You deserve it. Let's watch.
No es difícil aprender a ser aseado.
I wanted to tell you about my medical condition, ADHD, which affects my concentration, makes me distracted.
Solo quería contarle sobre todo el tema.
Okay, so we didn't know this before, I don't think, that he has ADHD. I don't know to what degree, but it is a good idea to inform her, I think particularly because it relates to her complaints about him. And we'll see how they navigate this conversation.
La condición médica que afecta mi concentración para distraerme.
It's not that I'm doing it on purpose. It's just that sometimes I forget that say, for example, the clothes are on the floor. I forget that they're there, then I forget to put it into the washing machine.
Right. So I don't know about Mike, but commonly with ADHD, one's working memory and executive function is impaired. And one of the outcomes of having an average executive function and working memory is that when you're doing tasks, and we have a lot of them throughout the day, I mean, that we probably didn't have 100,000 years ago or even a couple hundred years ago, like when you get dressed or when you're getting undressed. There are so many steps. If you really just break down all the little things that you need to do in order for the whole task to have been completed, like undressing, for example, it's like, okay, start with this garment, take it off, put it down, put it, clump up your stuff, find the hamper, put your clothes back, find what drawer you're supposed to get the stuff, get, each item, put it out, does it coordinate ish? What is required for the day, put it on, close the drawers. There's so many different steps. And for the average person, their working memory and their executive function is such that it's not a problem. It's like obvious and it doesn't require much. But if you have any incursion on that, like if you get a phone call in the middle or your kid is crying and you get distracted and you tend to that and you come back, it takes a while to kind of remember, where was I in this step? Think about something more elaborate, like you're cooking something or you're doing homework or something. It can really be hard for people with ADHD. Sometimes stimulants can help, but sometimes it doesn't. And stimulants obviously have their side effects on growth and on sleep and on mood and anyway. And there can also be tolerance, meaning that you need more because it's just like caffeine or cocaine or something. Eventually your body gets used to it. And so it's hard. And so he's saying that it's hard for him to remember all the steps. And so as he's getting undressed, something will get in the way and he will forget to put the clothes into the hamper or to clean up after himself. He's trying to explain that to her. And so let's see how she responds. The other aspect of this is that if there's any distraction, so like I said, to the average person, executive function, if there's a distraction, say your kid crying, you're going to pay attention to that and go tend to it because that is higher priority than getting dressed. But let's say, I don't know, something crosses your mind like, oh, remember that video game you want to play later? To the average person, it doesn't. They're like, oh, I'll play that later. I need to tend to this. There's 8 more steps here. And you don't even have to really think about it. It's just the executive function, your prefrontal cortex just automatically evaluates whether or not the distraction is actually like something to pay attention to and what the because your working memory and your executive function is keeping track of all these little things. There's all these little calculations of what am I doing right now versus what that distraction is, and it just automatically kicks in. That is for later. I'm in the middle of something. To the person with ADHD, their function around that is very much impaired depending on their degree of ADHD, and so the distraction, the calculation doesn't kick in, and so they're like, oh yeah, video game, I want to do that, and so they go off in video game, and then they come back into the room and they're like, I only got halfway dressed. What happened there? And what happened? Like, it's like this, my room is just a disaster. And then what happens over time is, as a individual, you just get used to it. And one, you become kind of tolerant of a mess. The second thing is you just think of yourself as a messy person and someone who doesn't complete tasks. And so you start to identify, particularly if you're being yelled at all the time. And so you just start to identify as someone who's kind of a messy, screw up, absent-minded person when that's actually not true. It's just that there's a difference in executive function. So let's see how Ximena understands that.
No es que lo esté haciendo a propósito. Es solo que a veces me olvido de que dicen, por ejemplo, la ropa en el suelo. Olvidé que están ahí, que olvidé ponerlo en la lavadora.
Now, I will say that people with ADHD who know and get proper treatment understand that they have to, even if they're not being medicated or the meds aren't working sufficiently, they have to utilize a number of skills to keep them on track. They can't just rely on trying harder, and that's often what is expected of. And that's kind of what Ximena was saying earlier. It's like it doesn't take much to be clean, doesn't take much to be an adult and pick up after yourself. And he's saying actually it is hard. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means they have to put extra effort in. But our brains are like muscles in that the more effort we exert to concentrate, the harder it is to concentrate later. And there's fatigue and all sorts of things. So we only have so much energy concentration-wise we can put into it. And so to ask someone with ADHD to just like super concentrate on something all day long is too much to ask. It's just not really humanly possible. But they can do things, and they can also have workarounds. Like sometimes they'll have a list. They'll write it out because it's easier. Like if you're putting together an IKEA bookshelf, you don't just look at the instruction manual and put it aside. Like you go step by step because you couldn't possibly remember all the steps. Well, that's kind of what it's like to have ADHD. When they're getting dressed, they have to, okay, this, and then they don't have to have a working memory in that situation. They don't have to have that the only executive function effort they have to do is stick to the list. Don't diverge from distractions. Stick to the list. Where was I on the list? And so sometimes writing it out, and there's other things that one can do as well. Someone could help and say like, oh, I saw that you got distracted. Remember, get back to the thing, complete that, and then you can go do that thing. Sometimes outside help. So it's not like it just means he is, Mike is just like off the hook, but it does provide that, pretty significant context.
¿Desde hace cuánto tú sufres de esto que se te olvidan las cosas? Explícame bien porque no entiendo nada.
It's almost like a learning disability. It has something to do with the brain. Around middle school, I was diagnosed with ADHD, so I get distracted easily. I'll forget to do certain things.
Yeah, okay. So Ximena seems to be reacting well. She's like, I don't get it. And that's pretty common because it's a pretty complicated thing, and it is often reduced to hyperactivity, like you're just rambunctious as a person, which can be an effect at certain ages, but isn't the dominant experience, which is the one that I'm talking about. Certainly you can have hyperactivity and rambunctiousness in addition to that, but it's really what I was talking about in terms of working memory and executive function and the ability to like hold on to many steps in your mind all at once. And then these tertiary effects with self-esteem and having schemas of I'm a screw up and there's something wrong with me will kick in because people just don't understand. They're trying. The person with ADHD is trying throughout their life because kids are always trying to please. But when they just fail and fail and fail, they conclude, oh, I'm a screw up. Sometimes they're literally told there's something wrong with you. In fact, Ximena even had that language with him. She's not responsible for him and his ADHD and whatever complexes he had because he's an adult now. But that language of what's wrong with you? Like, how come you can't figure this out? You're obviously not putting effort into it. You're not trying hard enough. You're not applying yourself. And the ADHD person has no idea. It's like, okay, I guess I'm not trying hard enough. How come every other kid seems to be doing well? It must be something about me. I must not be trying. And then eventually it's just like, well, I give up because why try? And let's just, realize that I'm a screw up. He got diagnosed in middle school. That's later than we would hope, but still early enough for at least some repair to be done. So let's see how they navigate it.
And a lot of things that Ximena wants me to change, like the organization, which is attributed to ADHD, is not all my fault. because it's been like a struggle, like basically my whole life, to try to find other ways and work around it.
Good. I'd like to hear what those are. But yeah, I'm guessing he had some help along those lines. Like with kids, you will give them homework. And, with 8th graders, you don't expect them to be super organized. So there's like 8th grade appropriate kinds of, but I'll tell you, the way that 8th graders today are expected to do things are way beyond what they were even for me. And that was probably way beyond the way it was for my parents growing up. So sometimes I see 8th graders with like college level expectations, which I don't think is a good idea, honestly, for all kids. Anyway, so for kids, you will often say, okay, here's your homework, do it at home, and it's due tomorrow. And for the most part, you can expect kids to retain that. But just think of all the steps you have to retain in your working memory for that day. You have to remember, even as they're assigned. So as the kid, the teacher is blah, blah, blahing, you have to not be distracted. Okay, so you have to have heard that whole presentation, even if it's just 2 sentences, and you have to have downloaded it into your head and like comprehended it and really absorbed it. Then you have to, as the homework is being passed out, do they still have paper homework today? Anyway, as the paper is passed around, and it gets on your desk, you have to connect that piece of homework with what the teacher said maybe 30 seconds ago, and it might have gone already. Contrast that with, for someone with average executive function, if you tell them in January there's going to be a big assignment due in 3 months, but you don't have to work on it right now, but here's the explanation, 99% of the kids, if that's all you do, are not going to turn it in 3 months, because you just told them once, and you can even say, if you don't do it, you're going to flunk. You could have massive consequences, and most of the kids just aren't going to do it because you didn't remind them. It's just too much for their brain to manage, right? So it's similar to that with someone with ADHD, to say blah, 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 and then to pass something. And then, so they have to connect that, okay? And then they have to remember, okay, the next step is put it away, okay? So I've got to get my bag out. Again, this is no distractions. And when that's happening, a lot of times kids are ruffling and chatting or something, and there's distractions. So you got to put it into your bag. Then, as you're leaving the class, you got to remember your bag. That's a step, right? Working memory, like I have a bag. For the average person, that's pretty easy to remember. But even for the average person, sometimes we'll forget stuff like that. But anyway, so you got to remember, I'm leaving school now. Get the bag, pick it up, put it on, get all my other stuff, walk home, make sure you make it home on time, and where are your keys? Okay, you could have lost your keys. Get into the house, and then we're talking hours later, right, with lots of distractions, to remember I have that assignment. And you probably have like 5 assignments that are at best in your bag, right? So you got to remember that at 7:00. Pull out your bag. You have to remember which ones are due tomorrow and which ones aren't, and what's the priority, because maybe out of the 5 assignments, there's 4 that are more important than the one or something. So all that has to be remembered and held in your short-term memory and just kind of churning. For people with ADHD, that stuff is gone. I mean, it is just like, it sometimes just never even got in there because of the brain. It's a learning disability. And so then you got to pull it out. Okay, there's several steps. You got to pull out your folder. You got to remember where that thing was. You got to remember what it looks like, because maybe you got all sorts of stuff in there. And you got to remember, pull out the assignment. And then you got to remember, what were we talking about today? Because, usually the lecture had to do with the assignment, and because maybe you did all that, right? But you look at the thing, you're like, what is that? I don't even understand. Then you have to, if there were instructions on how to get information on to be the basis of doing that assignment, you got to remember where to look for that. You got to remember what they were talking about. It's a lot to hold on to. For the average kid, if it's an age-appropriate assignment, they will remember because their brain is within normal limits and they retain all that information. I mean, just think about all the information. Now, of course, 3 years later, you're not going to remember, but you will remember that day because it was just earlier that day, and that's the way our memory works. We tend to retain things that are short-term for a while until that stuff gets dumped. So You got to remember to do that. Then you got to remember to do it. You got to remember how to do it. Then you have to remember to put it back in your bag. Then you got to do all the other stuff. Then the next day when you're going out the door, you got to remember to bring your bag, okay? Because you have homework in there. You got to. Then you got to, when you get to school and you put your bag down, you've got to remember that the homework is in there, and you got to remember where it was. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids I would work with ADHD that we would have done all this stuff. I would have sat there and helped them do their homework, and then they go to school and they forget to turn it because, you know, the teacher might say, okay, turn in your homework, and really quick. And then even though they're like, oh yeah, homework, but then distraction. And then it's like, or they just forgot. They're just used to saying, well, I don't usually do homework. I'm sure it's not in there. But they did do it, but they don't remember it because they're not super concentrating on it, okay? So that's potentially, it's not what it's like for everyone with ADHD, but that is kind of what it's like. And if you don't have support, and even if you do have support, you know, I've worked with kids with ADHD, and so many people just don't get it. Teachers, other classmates, and it can be demoralizing to a child. And then you have even worse personality effects. Like I said, you have these ideas that you're a screw up. There's something wrong with you. No one's going to love you. You might as well just become a drug burnout or something. Anyway.
Para mí es muy importante saber qué tienes tú, saber sobre ti para poderte ayudar, ¿me entiendes?
Okay, good. She seems to be being kind and understanding and saying, I don't get it, but I want to understand, you know, affection. So really good sign there.
Pero que desde ahora en adelante no hayan secreto entre nosotros, que seamos honestos del uno al otro si queremos llevar esta relación bien. ¿Estás de acuerdo?
I'm sorry for not telling you this. It's just that, I don't know. I just was afraid.
Lamento.
Great. I mean, we couldn't have asked for it to have gone better. It sounds like she still has some more to learn about his experience, and she's open to that, and she's caring, and maybe this will really help them, for her to see, that explains a lot. That means he's not a child or disrespectful of me. It just means he has this difference that makes it a little harder for him, and you know, it doesn't indicate that he doesn't care, or that he's being disrespectful, or that he's irresponsible in general.
Después de escuchar esto, creo que me siento bien porque hay razones por las que él actuó así, pero todavía estoy nerviosa porque tenemos tanto que aprender del uno al otro. Yo te amo mucho.
It's good. So she is seeing it, I think, in the best way, that, oh, wow, okay, that really helps to understand that, and I'm not going to stigmatize him. I trust him. I trust that he is telling me the truth. I trust that he is not making an excuse for himself. We could imagine other cast members saying that, right?
Y quiero que aprendas a hacer las cosas bien, bueno?
I love you very much. I don't want to lose you. I want you to learn to do things well good.
Thank you for understanding me, because most people didn't.
Gracias por entenderme, porque la mayoría de...
And then we wonder if this had any effect on his not dating. We don't know why he didn't date for so long. It could have just been because he just didn't care to, but it's possible that his early experiences with people in general, even dating, might have caused him to say, there's just something wrong with me. I can't do this.
Leaving soon.
Así que me iré pronto.
What would you guys think if I gave your mom a ring before I left?
¿Qué pensarían ustedes si le diera un...
So I assume that Mike has Ximena's permission to talk with the kids about this, but if not, then yikes. But I assume that he does. But even so, I would not recommend this. The kids are too young. This is too early in the relationship to ask them questions like this. But you know, what are they supposed to say? What if they're ambivalent? What if they're unsure? So I just feel like it's just I think that Ximena should be having this conversation with the kids, and it shouldn't be like asking the kids their opinions. I mean, obviously their opinion matters, and the mom and both of them should listen to that. But the way that this is, what would you think if I asked your mom to marry me? That's putting, I mean, it's not terrible pressure, but it's not, I wouldn't recommend it.
Un anillo a su mamá antes de irme.
No sé.
Do you know what it means when someone gets married?
¿Sabes lo que significa cuando alguien se casa?
No.
Basically means that
And I think most of the reason why I'm uncomfortable is, as often is the case on this show, the relationship at this phase, particularly since we heard Ximena's attitude last week that seemed to indicate that her dedication to Mike was pretty ambivalent, that it's just too early to have this conversation with them. At some point you would, something along these lines for sure, but I feel like, well, what if it doesn't work out and the kids are like, did I answer it wrong? And it's just getting them too wrapped up in it.
I love your mom and I want to be with your mom and be a father to you guys, you and Harold. Do you want me to be your dad?
See, again, that's even a more pointed question that I wouldn't recommend. What are the kids supposed to say? And again, this should be from Ximena. She should be having this conversation with them. It's not horrible. I mean, on the scale of things, like we saw with Daniel, with what I can't remember their names now, but anyway, in terms of triangulation involving Danielle. So there's Danielle the kid, and then Danielle and her kids. There seem to be indications of way too much adult talk with children.
May me dijo que si quería que yo fuera el hijo y yo estoy feliz porque es bueno. Y me voy a sentir muy triste porque May.
Right, it's another reason that could be a risk here, which is that if they get too attached and too expecting, if and when it doesn't work out, it can be even more devastating to them knowing that it was headed towards him being in their lives forever. So given the phase of relationship, it's just, I think it would have been more prudent that what you tell the kids is that they're just dating, or I don't know, he's visiting, he's a friend or something like that. And then once you're really sure that things are going to be forever, that's when you start talking along these lines. And then you would want to have these kinds of conversations. Again, it should be Ximena.
Yo no me voy a ir de empleada a Mai, no me irá a reemplazar a su mamá. O sea, yo pienso mucho de esas cosas.
Pero lo importante es que usted sienta amor por él y él por usted, con buena paciencia y todo lo va acostumbrando. ¿Vea? Yo cuando me junté con papá, yo no sabía ni hacer de comer y me enseñó.
So we're hearing Ximena's narrative is still, look, I'm not going to be his slave, I'm not going to be his mother, which is respectable, and absolutely. I think Mike is open to talking about that. I don't think he expects you to be that way. So I'm wondering where that comes from. Maybe she knows more about his expectations than we do, which would make sense. And then the mom says, well, it really comes down to love. If you love someone, you'll work with someone and you'll communicate, like I did with your dad when I first met him. I wanted him to make some changes, but love carried us through that, which is a huge question given at least the way they're editing it, is that with Ximena, how strong is her love for Mike? Because there's some indications that it's not very strong, because at the first sign of anything going wrong, she's just like, I'm out, which is fine, obviously, if she isn't that into him or has strong preferences that are deal breakers, it's totally fine, but it is kind of a question at this point.
Ser como esa profesora que él necesita, más esposa y
Pues eso es lo que estoy
compañera.
haciendo ahora.
Well, it's interesting. So the mom is essentially saying you need to be, well, she literally said you need to be his teacher and his wife, which is not a necessity. Maybe culturally that's the norm, and certainly in the States that can be a part of mainstream culture. But that's a lot to put on. Now, if both partners are helping each other out in various ways, then it's mutual, I suppose. But sometimes this expectation is put on women that they're not fully fledged, free human beings. You know, they're here to serve their parents when they're young, and then they're here to serve their husband when they get married, and then they're here to serve their kids, and that's really all that they are. And it's possible that that's what the mom is talking about. You know, think about like Jenny and Summit. There were messages around that. And maybe Ximena is really, strict about like, I reject that cultural notion. I don't want to be that. And there's some signs that I'm going to have to be that with Mike, and I don't want to be that way. But Mike seems open. He just explained ADHD. So I'm guessing Mike wouldn't say, I left those on the floor for you to pick up because you're my slave. He would say, I left them on the floor because I forget things like that. And so you just don't pick it up, just tell me to pick it up and I'll pick it up.
Sí, pero puede ser por el momento. Ma y yo hemos hablado sobre casarnos y ahora estoy muy nerviosa que nos estamos precipitando en esto. Sé que Mai me ama, pero el matrimonio es para siempre. Entonces creo que hay cosas que debo pensar.
Yeah, absolutely. That's rational. There are a lot of things to consider, and it is too fast according to most people's standards. So if it's just a matter of I want more time, yeah, absolutely.
Jimé, ¿y usted no se ha puesto a pensar que si usted termina con él, que bueno, que ya no va a tener con qué pagar un apartamento, que le toca ponerse a trabajar?
Y Mike pues se mira que él quiere los niños y él dice que él va a responder con ellos, van a tener un futuro muy bien con él. Entonces usted debe pensar en eso.
Sí,
Pensar en sus hijos, no solamente en usted.
Well, I don't think this is fair. So the parents are saying you need to marry him not because of your heart, but because the kids need him in terms of financial help or something. And, that's a factor, right? But it shouldn't be the only thing she thinks about. Or I don't think she wants to only think about that, which is fair.
Sí, yo los entiendo, claro, y pues sí, claro, obvio, por el futuro de mis hijos y que va a ser mejor el estudio para ellos.
Claro, y un empleo mejor y donde la plata vale más.
Reciba los consejos que nosotros le damos como padres, y yo sé que le va bien.
All right. Well, if you haven't become a patron of the podcast, that's how you can show that you really appreciate what we're doing here. When people become patrons, it literally is the fuel that keeps us going on this channel. If it weren't for the patrons, I wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff. So if you become a patron, thanks. If you become an upper tier patron, that's even cooler. And an annual patron, that's also cool. But it's up to you, of course. People are on different budgets these days, of course. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.